let's kick it off. People of the Kulin Nation, on whose land this presentation was recorded. This is and always will be Aboriginal land. Their sovereignty was never ceded. Despite the somewhat idiosyncratic nature of this presentation, I would also like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mentors that I had growing up. Although it's not their traditional type of stories, I would not be able to tell stories the way that I did if I hadn't had the benefit of their teachings. Good day to you all. It is wonderful to see you all here today for this briefing on Cyborg Security. I hope that you all found the briefing centre all right. Now, before we commence, there is some additional data which all of you are going to need. If you wish to take out the devices with which you have been issued, you will find them in your pockets and scan the detailed information which is up on the big screen currently. You will be taken to all of the additional data that you need in order to follow along with this briefing. So you want to be a cyborg? Well, you've come to the right place. I myself have many years of experience in both medico-cybernetics and recreational cybernetics. And if you're wondering how I got that, well, the simple answer is I've been involved in cyborg communities for many years, and what I hope to present to you today is an honest briefing on the benefits and pitfalls, if you will, of becoming part of the recreational Internet of Things network. Now, when I talk about the history of medico-cybernetics, my experience is not just in the low-tech augment medico-cybernetics field. I have, in fact, at various points been hooked up to many devices, some of which have at points been life-sustaining, and others of which have been more used for their advanced monitoring functions, shall we say. Now, the thing that's worth understanding here is that even those devices which are used for advanced monitoring functions do come with pitfalls. The point at which you bridge the gap between simply augmenting yourself physically and deciding that you wish to connect yourself up to the Internet of Things network is the point at which you need to become much more careful about the data that you might be transmitting and how that data might be used. Now, I'm not just talking about this from personal experience here. There has in fact been a lot of great work done by the folks at the independent broadcasting station ProPublica. You may have heard of them. It frequently appears that as far as many people in our circles, shall we say, are concerned, ProPublica would be the nuisances. And they've done some really good deep dives on the matter of cyborg security. It turns out that as we are progressing towards the technological future, in some cases we have, shall we say, advanced features at the expense of general safety, which is always rather an unfortunate outcome. This has been very well illustrated in many people who have experienced augmentation. One of the early use cases for Internet of Things enabled augmentation was in fact pacemakers, and there are many people who have explored the security constraints of those sorts of devices, including ones who have them implanted in their own bodies. Now, the benefit there of the augment is clear. If the heart that one is issued with by default does not work, it seems only logical that we should in fact replace that with a technological equivalent. However, when the technological equivalents are used for other basic functions, such as communication, the risk-benefit ratio can occasionally be less clear, including in cases when the augments catch on fire, which in technical parlance we would call not recommended. But it's not just augmentation for profit that we're here to talk about. We're also here to talk about augmentation for the purposes of fun. And there are many, many ways in which one can recreationally explore this, recreationally hook oneself up to the Internet of Things network. You can look at everything here from augmenting features which are not considered essential but which one might have missing. A great case study here is the practice of hearing color, which was popularized by one of the very early pioneers of the legal rights of cyborgs. A gentleman who augmented himself by attaching an antenna to his head to allow him to perceive color and overcome the deficit, depending on how you look at it, of a chromatopsia with which he was born. And then there are scenarios which are just far more recreational, like the idea of being able to unlock your whole house with an RFID implant in your hand, or putting an NFC chip in yourself and then downloading all of your financial data onto it and using it as a single source of truth for everything. One of the crucial differences between medico-cybernetics and recreational cybernetics is obviously the paradigm of necessity. And in that case, we're going to talk about medico-cybernetics first because it's the scenario which presents the larger number of pitfalls. If you find yourself with a medical need for augmentation, as I have done, and as many others have done throughout their lifetimes, one thing that you'll learn very quickly is that in this future towards which we are progressing, you don't always have quite as much control as you think you should, or certainly as much control as you might want, which has been very well illustrated, particularly in the case of hackable hearts. If one finds that one must have some sort of augmentation implanted in order to replace one's originally issued heart, then one of the pitfalls that one will run into very quickly is that not only does one not have control over the piece of hardware, one might not even have access, well, one almost certainly won't have access to the underlying software running on the hardware implanted in their bodies. This has been explored by a number of people. It was explored at great length by Karen Sandler, another pioneer of early cyborgs. It was also explored by a couple of journalists who themselves had direct experience of this. But the use case here which is most illuminating is in fact the one which was brought to the forefront of consciousness by ProPublica. This specifically being the use case of an obsolete device being implanted into the human body with no way to remove it. This is what we call, in parlance, a fail-deadly safety. One has to have this thing implanted in one's body to substitute for the non-functioning or malfunctioning organ with which one was issued at birth. Unfortunately, when the augment fails, the consequences can be just as catastrophic as the originally issued organ failing, if not more so. To put it in plain language, the human heart, when it fails, does not generally catch on fire. This has been a known issue with some of the augments which people have had implanted to replace malfunctioning hearts. There's a bit of food for thought. The problem is that recreational cybernetics has a similar set of pitfalls. They're just often not as well enumerated. How hard would it be for someone to hack that NFC chip that you got implanted in your hand to augment all of your financial data into a format which you couldn't lose? I mean, I'm probably preaching to the choir here. I am sure that many of you have lost a certain piece of plastic with a certain chip that has financial data encoded into it at least once in your life. But if we find that that particular piece of plastic has some sort of critical security flaw, there is a very simple way of dealing with it. We take out a pair of scissors, we cut it up, we put it in whatever disposal receptacle we have handy to us, we acquire a new one, and we continue on our day. Once that data is stored on an implant which is in someone's body, it requires further augmentation to update or remove. Which brings us to the first critical paradigm of cyborg security. Understand how your augments will be updated and secured continuously. We live in a world where technology moves at great speed. It seems that any time you turn your head, some sort of new vulnerability in some sort of critical system is disclosed, and everyone finds themselves falling over themselves to fix it before the whole cybernetic system performs the great collapse. That's rather easy when all that you have to do is pull some chips out of racks or connect whatever system you're dealing with to the internet and run some updates. It's less easy when updating augments, because updating augments, if you do not have a way to connect them, requires surgery. The second critical paradigm to talk about when one is dealing with cyborg security is not just understanding the security of the software, but understanding the security of the hardware of the augments which you will be implanting into your bodies. That case study that we were talking about with cybernetic hearts, that's a particularly fun one because the issue with the augment there was actually a hardware-based one. It was not the software of the augment which was blowing up, it was the hardware that was inherent to the system as it was built prior to implantation. And that can cause all manner of problems because, again, once it's in, it's rather hard to get it out. The critical piece of data to bear in mind here is that the smaller the device component which is implanted under the human skin, the easier it is to hot swap components should one discover hardware vulnerabilities. So if we take another early example of medico-cybernetics in insulin pumps, a case study which I have explored many times in the past in terms of general software and hardware augmentations, one of the things that one will notice about the insulin pump as a case study is that there's actually very little of it which is implanted into the human body. The vast majority of the augment is outside, and this means that if one cleverly designs the augment, one can hot swap parts almost at will. This is much harder when one is dealing with something like a pacemaker, which must be implanted under the skin for a significant period of time, and indeed is a type of augment which lies wholly within the human body. But then one runs into edge cases like the case of the artificial heart, where parts of the device are implanted within the body and parts of the device are externalized. So again, the thing that I would stress here for those of you who have a specific interest in medico-cybernetics, whether it be in designing such devices or whether you're here because you're about to have one implanted in you, is to understand how much of that device is externalized and understand how much of that device can be hot swapped and replaced at will. Even if the answer is not favorable, understanding that will allow you to run a risk-benefit equation, which will make you a much more informed cyborg as you go through the process. Another salient point to highlight is the fact that if one is engaging in recreational cybernetics, in hardware terms, there are a couple of different ways in which one can do this. One can walk into any augment supply store, purchase some sort of NFC or RFID chip off a shelf, hack around it however one pleases, and then find some way to insert it into one's body. Bam! You are augmented. Welcome to the ranks of the cyborg. But in other cases, one might be dealing with kits which are solely off the shelf. So another critical thing to understand if you're interested specifically in recreational cybernetics is not just how much of it is implanted in the body, but how much of it you can engineer yourself and what your confidence interval is compared to the confidence interval of manufacturers who work with these sorts of augments all the time. If you are indeed a skilled hardware modifier, you might find that your comfort level is very high, and theoretically, you would then have a scenario where you could build and implant an augment entirely by yourself using hardware blueprints, which could then be made available to anyone in any location on any planet. And even if you are not entirely certain whether it has flaws, any hardware flaws which exist will be discovered rather quickly once you publish the schematic, provided that you manage to get a sufficient number of eyes on it. Whereas if one is dealing with an off-the-shelf manufacturer, the confidence interval may be higher, particularly if you're not an experienced hardware augmenter, but you will have to contend with the fact that those schematics are often not publicly available, and therefore those sorts of augments don't go through the standard vetting process that would be expected from cyborg initiatives which are run solely by the community. Now, back to the software for a moment, since we're talking about the recreational aspect of it. There's an assumption that even if one doesn't control the hardware of a recreational implant, one will have a reasonable amount of control over the software that it runs. If you're dealing with something like an RFID or NFC chip, this is obviously not going to be particularly advanced, but if you're interested in more complex recreational augments, you might find yourself building a significant amount of software or modifying a significant amount of software off the shelf in order to get the augment to do what you actually want it to do. You may also find that you come into it with a particular view of how it's set up, and that what you want to do is actually not possible. And this brings me to the topic of managing pings. Our hardware and our software evolve. As the cyborg community builds augments, those augments become significantly more technologically advanced. An important thing to understand here is, what are the capabilities going to be in 10 years' time of an augment which is placed in your body now? If you feel that you want to take advantage of more advanced capabilities, are you going to end up in a solution where, because of the software overhead which is required to run them, you're required to modify augments or augment yourself again? These are all important things to understand. And then there's the necessity of, generally, if you want to go beyond augmenting and actually connect yourself to the human Internet of Things network, understanding that you will have to manage pings, you will have to manage public connectivity, and set up some sort of security to ensure that everything that you are doing with your augment is not world readable. That can go very badly, believe me, I've looked at some of those devices. And on the medico-cybernetic side, part of managing pings means accepting that you probably won't actually have access to the code, and you might not even know what it's doing. One of the journalists, who became very well known for writing about his experiences with early medico-cybernetics devices, including a hackable heart, noted that all of the professions on the medico side of medico-cybernetics that he was dealing with expressed a great deal of discomfort when he finally decided to shut himself off from the Internet of Things permanently and simply turn off the update function of his hackable heart. That's a trade-off that each cyborg should be able to make for themselves. There are times where you may want that connectivity to be available. There are times where the risk of being hacked is so great that you pretty much want to just shut the connectivity off, where the risk of being part of the Internet of Things might mean something to do with human safety. Doesn't really matter how much you augment yourself, although metal is admittedly better than meat, we still will have to deal with some degree of meat sack. The worst case scenario, regardless of whether it's hardware or software based, is a hostile takeover. This is where some sort of malicious actor wrestles control of your augment away from you. In some scenarios, that malicious actor may be another meat sack. In some scenarios, that malicious actor may simply be a rogue computer. And in some scenarios, the malicious actor will be the device itself, as we've seen in the case of the hackable hearts which catch on fire. Hostile takeovers are probably the worst risk scenario for cyborgs, because they may necessitate total device removal. Now, my personal experience with this is as a cyborg whose augments are external, but I can certainly say that this is something that I have looked at in the vetting process of many of the machines that I've been attached to at various points. So be aware of what the signs of a hostile takeover are. As much as we are all here for the purposes of augmentation, it's still critical to listen to the meat sack, understand the failure states, understand the warning signs, and do bear in mind that any hostile takeover scenario may ultimately require device removal. Be prepared for that. understand that. I hope that this briefing has given you some information on whether you wish to embark on the journey yourself of becoming a cyborg. At the very least, if it is a journey that is to be thrust upon you, I hope that you now have a more informed understanding of the risks and benefits of doing so. If I can leave all of you in this location with one takeaway today, the takeaway that I would like to leave you with is experiment yourself. And this begins if you're in a medico-cybernetic scenario dealing with a device which you have little to no control over and are unable to modify. This begins with understanding what the limits are, making frequent requests for data, speaking to all of the various companies which produce medico-cybernetic devices for your particular use case, and recruiting professionals on the medico side who have a better understanding and are willing to work with your assessment of the risks and benefits. Now, if you're going into this purely recreationally to enhance your capabilities in some manner, rather than to replace capabilities which are actively harmful to you, then the important thing to understand is that as far as you are able, you can hack these devices yourself. In fact, if you're in a medico-cybernetic scenario and you find a particularly willing manufacturer, you may even be able to do that yourself. Test the limits of it. I talked a little bit earlier about insulin pumps as one of the very early case studies, and they are a brilliant example of the cyborg community coming together to produce augments which would not have been possible without experimentation. Again, I have given briefings on this before. If you're curious about what the whole story is, go and see those. It has been lovely to be here to talk to you all today on an area of some expertise of mine. And I hope that regardless of whether or not you become a cyborg in future, you leave this briefing today informed and with a deeper understanding of the challenges that face us as we move towards a more augmented future.
Hello,
Hello.
Dawn. How are you?
Hello, I am in a hotel room. I am coming to you as a sci-fi B-movie cyborg from a hotel room in Los Angeles.
What time is it over there at the moment?
It is 21:39.
Oh,
Not too bad. Not too bad. When did you arrive? Today?
Yesterday.
Yesterday. It's all right. All right.
I
Love to talk.
Thank you.
I did notice one interesting joke in the chat about the heart that was catching fire, in that was a bad case of heartburn.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting, and I've been trying to have this argument at work recently, is the significant relationship between security and safety, i.e.
Yes.
Linking the two things together. So my dad's actually a safety engineer and I do cyber, and the amount of conversations that we've had where they're actually so interwoven and linked that you can have a security issue that then causes safety aspects, or a safety issue that's, yada yada. And I think this is another great example of that, but it's more direct to a person.
Yes. Yes. This is an argument that I've made many times in talking about the crossover between security and accessibility, is that when you're dealing with medical devices in particular, security is actually an accessibility issue. And it's that kind of crossover between security, accessibility, and safety. Like, what do you feel safe having attached to your body, or what do you feel safe actually putting in your body?
Yeah, absolutely.
And like, in particular in that hackable heart, the hackable hearts or the heart catching on fire thing, like if you have heart failure and you're using some sort of augmentation to deal with that, okay, the failure state of your heart sucking is your heart sucking, but the failure state of something implanted in your body catching on fire, that's not a trade-off you want to have to decide between.
It's a different set of risks, right? You think that you're not saving yourself, but you're improving your situation by having these devices, but they actually come with a completely different set of risks that you won't necessarily think of.
Yeah, and that's sort of my whole thing, is you can never entirely mitigate those risks, but the aim is to be more informed about what the risks actually are, and to understand, okay, if you're doing this, what are you doing to yourself, and understanding what the failure states might look like and what they mean, because then at least if you do end up with that fail deadly safety sort of scenario, you're prepared for it, rather than just going into something which is, you think this is great and you've sorted yourself out, and then it just blows up.
So I suppose a question, and if anybody else has any questions, please put them in the Discord chat. A question from me, we only see great change in cyber when something really bad happens. So I think the example recently is the Optus breach and the regulatory things that are coming in place with the Optus breach. Do you think it's going to take something like that to happen before medical? Because I think the fair assumption is medical devices are not as secure as they need to be. I think that's I think that's a fair statement. I know Alex talked about it last time.
Yeah.
Is there a way that we can get medical device manufacturers to make that change without having to go down that path of major incident, major issues first?
I mean, at that point, you've really got to do it in a regulatory manner. Like, you need one of the drug regulators or whomever regulates those devices in whichever country to actually step in. The insulin pump use case is a super interesting one, because that sort of illustrates the difference in regulatory frameworks between a lot of the countries where this stuff goes on. Like, I mean, there's a whole other story, and I think I might have linked the talks where I talk about the insulin pump use case in the sources that were up, and I'll stick those in the Discord immediately we're done here. But the insulin pumps is this whole really interesting use case, but you can actually see with that, the regulatory framework in every country is really different. And in some countries, it's very much like, we expect the device manufacturers to do this. In some places in Europe, it's like, hey, you want to hack together an open system? Here's some insulin pumps that can do it. Go for your life. Whereas if you're in a lot of other countries, you are relying on getting in through existing security vulnerabilities. So it's very complicated, and it's probably going to take the regulators somewhere to step up and say, hey, we're not approving your devices until you're doing things like proper penetration testing.
So
do I think it's ever going to happen? No.
Well, that's the thing. There's a hope, right? But then there's a realistic statement. I guess last question from me, and it's probably relevant noting your interest also in things like Linux Conf, is open source and manageable, what's the term I'm looking for? Repairable and all those kind of hardware the answer in this case, or does that potentially introduce some issues on its own as well?
Well, I quoted, in a previous presentation that I have done, I quoted Lana Brindley, who's a frequent contributor at LCA and is an excellent human. She did a presentation called Facebook Dynamite, Uber Bombs, and You. And the line that I took away from that is open source bad is better than closed source bad. The reason for that is open source bad means you've actually got more eyes on it.
Yeah.
So the advantage of things like open source setting up devices in that manner is you can actually have other people look at it, and that's going to give you a much more informed look at where your risks are. When it's closed source and, the manufacturer is not releasing the source code to anyone, or when it's hardware that's built and you don't get to see a schematic, it might be that there are super, super obvious failure points that a decent engineer is going to be able to pick up if they spend enough time reverse engineering it. But if that information is not public, your competitors can reverse engineer it, but having that information private makes it much harder for people to actually find those risks. So I'm all for open source everything around medical devices where it's possible. Yes, you introduce risks there that people are going to find the problems. So it then becomes a thing of, do you think the people who are on your side are going to find the problems better than the people who aren't?
No, that's fantastic. Look, thank you very much, Dawn, and that was an amazing talk. And thank you
for
joining
us
for
having
from
me.
the middle of the night.
Thank you
for being here. But yeah, thanks very much.